It's no secret that there are a lot of churches in decline. The number of churches in decline are rapidly increasing, and there are just more and more people pressing for exactly what to do about that. It's a very important conversation, and I really can't think of anybody who's more qualified to have that conversation and answer those questions than a guy named Thom Rainer. He wrote a book a number of years ago called Autopsy of a Deceased Church. We reviewed that book here on the channel. I'm going to put a link here on the screen. It's a card you can click on to go straight to that review. In that book, he talked about all the signs of what a dying church looks like. And a lot of churches read that book and said, wow, we have some of these things. We got to kind of kick it into gear. Well, the next question is exactly what do we do? And this book, The Anatomy of a Revived Church, is Thom Rainer's take on what churches are actually doing that turn the corner from dying to revived life. Exactly what are they doing? He studied a tremendous number of churches. He's like a church stats guru. I really, really trust what Rainer has to say on this. And I'm going to walk through the book and talk about exactly what it is that he says, and yet leave a few things for you just to be able to pick up the book and read for yourself. So he gives 7 things that churches can do to stem the tide, to go from decline and potential and imminent death to revival, which, by the way, he says that the number of churches that are on the verge of closing their doors, it's like 66,000 churches. He says 7,000 churches shut their door every single year. That's pre-COVID numbers. And he goes on to say in the introduction that 3/4 of churches in the United States are in decline, which means that they're on their path to dying. Something has to be done about this. We're going to explore the 7 things that he says can be done, what his findings were with each one, and what he recommends. Now, the first thing I want to say that's going to stand out in this 7 list is these are not new programs. Programs are not going to save the church. Programs may kind of give you a little shot of adrenaline. It's not going to save the church. If you have a heart attack patient on the table and they're in cardiac arrest, you give them a little shot of adrenaline, man, they may perk up just for a moment, but they're not really, that's not going to solve the blockage that's in their heart. Programs address symptoms. He's really getting at some deep-seated things here that really have to pay attention to. So the first thing is accepting responsibility. He basically says that if you are unwilling to accept responsibility, your church will unequivocally die. In psychology, we call this an internal locus of control. It's where does the problem stem from? Well, it stems from within. Churches with an external locus of control, churches with an external view of that the threats are from the outside, there's always someone else to blame, and that blame shifting keeps a church from addressing the actual issues that are happening within its walls, within the church body. So what does he recommend with this blame shifting, this needing to accept responsibility? I mean, it's very, very simple. Stop blaming external factors and forces and start looking inside to see exactly what's going on, to accept responsibility. As Jocko Willink would say, to own the problem. Leaders have to own their problems. It's like when a president comes in, it's for the first, forever, they can say, well, that's the former president's fault. Every president does this now for the last 6 presidents. At some point, you're well, Mr. President, you've been a president for so long now. Isn't this your problem? Don't you have something to do with this? Well, if you've been an elder for any length of time, or you've been a minister for any length of time, then, we're culpable for these things. We have to own up to our part of the responsibility. The next is just being fixated on tradition. Traditions are not negative. Traditions are not necessarily positive. They're just pretty much neutral. But when a tradition, he says, becomes negative is when people fixate on the tradition, so much so that tradition can become an idol. He gives 10 different traditions that through his research and study and church consultation that he has found over and over and over again. And I'm not going to give you those examples. I'm going to let you go pick up the book and see that for yourself. The third is he says you got to expand your scorecard. What he means by that is you have to start paying attention to what you measure. What are your metrics? What do you think defines success? What kind of things, if you measure, if those numbers grow or decline, means it's success or failure? And I'm not going to give you all of his metrics, but discipleship is very important and involvement is very important. This is something at Backyard Church that we've very much stressed. We don't keep in every single week exact attendance. We kind of have in mind kind of rough averages of kind of where we're at and ebbs and flows, but we really want to pay attention to that involvement number. What is needed is to pay attention to what you count and to make sure that you're counting the right things. Look at the kind of things. Are you counting attendance? Are you counting givings? Are you counting baptisms? Are you counting, what are you counting? Are you counting the numbers of small groups? Are you counting the numbers of, what is it that your church counts? What do you, back old school day, have this little board that would go on the wall that would have the hymn numbers, and it would have church attendance last week, church attendance this week, and the little guy would shuffle up front, switch out the numbers in the middle of service. Everybody be watching that happen. If you remember that, you're old. You probably have a little bit of gray hair like this old guy does. But pay attention to what you measure and make sure you're measuring the right things. Now, the fourth thing that he talks about in this book is committing to powerful prayer. Now, I have to say, out of the whole book, this thing encouraged me the most. Like number 4, it just gave me the absolute most encouragement, because in Backyard Church, we have a prayer walk once a month, and sometimes it can be like, oh, only a couple people showed up. Like, I hope this is okay. Like, is God really blessing this? Or like we get together Saturday night for a prayer Zoom for Sundays. Like only a few people sometimes show up. Like, oh, is God blessing this? Is this okay? Here's what he says. If only even a couple people will commit to persistent, consistent prayer, will be prayer warrior people, that they will pray for the future of the church. They will pray for the revival of the church. They will pray for this turnaround. If just even a handful of people will commit to that, that's enough. That's enough. I was so encouraged by that point. So what are we to do about this? Start praying. If you're in the church, you can do this. This means any church can do this. He's not saying that the solution is to have a $10 million to do this latest mission program or something. It's like pray. Talk to God about it. Ask God for wisdom. Ask God for guidance. Ask God for empowerment, and to ask God for more people to pray about it, right? So prayer, persistent, powerful prayer. Even just, he says, like even a couple people, if even just a couple people will commit to this and God looks down and sees that, God can bless that. Now, the fifth one is dealing with toxic people. And this one really surprised me, because I would say, well, yeah, absolutely. And probably every church has some toxic people. He says every church does not have toxic people. And he defines exactly what a toxic person looks like. And it's not just someone who's disagreeable. It's not just someone who's hard to get along with. There's some really clear definitions he gives of a toxic person. And you're probably thinking, well, my church is exceptional. Like we probably have like 6 of these people. Maybe none of them are actually toxic on the level he's talking about. And what he says is, what are you supposed to do about that? You got to talk to them. You've got to confront it. And that most churches don't make the turnaround as long as the toxic person is still present. Okay? That's some tough stuff. That's why it's called leadership. So 6 is kind of like the first, the whole accepting of responsibility thing. Don't seek out silver bullet answers. Oh, if only we had the young preacher from across town or the guy from Texas. If only our worship was different. If only our location was different. He gives all these different things that churches kind of like see as like this magic bullet. And what it does is it's kind of like, again, magical thinking. Like if only this or only that, then we could thrive. It's like, well, maybe you have deep systemic issues that as long as you're passing the buck and as long as you think like symptomatic adjustments are going to fix your underlying problem, then you're stuck and you're going to die and the decline is not going to get shifted. You're going to bring some other preacher in here, change your worship style, only to find out you're exactly the same church with exactly the same leaders with just a different kind of worship style. And the last is choosing meaningful membership. And here's what he says about that. He says, and one thing he said that I didn't really agree with, he says church membership is biblical. Like, I don't really believe church membership is biblical. I don't see like attendance cards and membership requests and presentations in the Bible, so I wouldn't say it's biblical. The idea of involvement and participation and commitment are biblical. Church membership's not biblical, okay? I don't agree with him at all when he says that. But I agree with him in the sense that we need to get people to commit to participation and involvement in meaningful ministry. And here's the thing he says to do. Membership class. You got to have a membership class. Like, tell people what you want. Be specific. Be upfront. Don't leave them guessing. Give them on-ramps to the information. Give them on-ramps to access to involvement and participation, so it's not a mystery. It's like sometimes churches have these really convoluted membership involvement processes where it's like, you get this form and then you fill it out and you say all these things that you want to do, and then those sheets get handed off to ministry leaders who may or may not ever look at them, and then although you've asked that you could do like 20 or 30 things, like no one ever talks to you about it. Like, that's just too complicated. That's just too clunky. Just find 1 or 2 things for someone to do and ask them to do it, and then set a date. Like, get them doing it. Get them involved. Get them plugged in. The last thing in the book, after the 7 things he says that can be done to revive a dying church, is he gives 10 characteristics of inward-focused churches, and then he gives what outwardly focused churches do instead. I found that incredibly helpful. Again, we're going to save that for the book. We're not going to discuss that here. We don't want to give away too much of his secret sauce. Like on this video, we want to just kind of kick you back to the book. I put a link to the book in the description that you can buy and just check this out, because again, he says 3/4 of our churches are flailing, are struggling, are suffering. This book was written in 2020, but I'm pretty sure that the bulk of the research that went into this book was pre-pandemic, so the numbers are probably a little bit worse, and it's probably even a little bit more urgent that we get on this. And again, I also want to say, in conclusion, this is a short book. Like, you look at that, like it's like a 140-page book, and there's not like a ton in it. Like it's not like huge pages, right? So this is very doable. Like a volunteer elder can read this, and certainly a paid minister can read this and come up with some things that could be done. But one of the things that comes up so consistently throughout the book is prayer. We keep hammering on prayer. We cannot pray enough. We cannot pray specifically enough. We cannot pray consistently enough. Like, we need people devoted and dedicated and determined to pray about the future of the church and about God's movement, about his empowerment, about his giving us wisdom, and he will give us every single thing we need. And I believe that one of the reasons that churches are really struggling is because they're doing it on their own power rather than by God's power. They're doing it without relying on the Holy Spirit. We have to turn back to the Spirit. We have to turn back to the Word. We have to seek God's face, God's guidance, and we will watch God work. So I hope this is an encouragement to you to dive into this book. Again, it's not a program book like, you just need this super deacon program, or you just need this new amazing eldership training, which could be a good thing, or you just need the latest, greatest family approach to youth ministry discipleship, or all these kinds of things. It's like program. And, programs, again, they're symptomatic. Like, you can put Band-Aids on things, you can change approaches, but until you change the operating system, you're the same group of people you were before you made the change. And this is what's hard. He literally says in the opening of the book that many churches would rather die than make hard changes. And if that's your church, if that's where you're at, then that's just inevitable. Like, if that's the attitude is, well, we can never do the very things that we're called to do, called to lead, then death's inevitable. It's just inevitable. And maybe that's not all bad for every place, because God can take even dead things, as he says, that unless a seed falls to the ground and dies, that new things don't spring back to life from it. So appreciate you watching the video. As always, love for you to follow along and watch some more. The channel has over 300 videos of teaching, biblical teaching, ministry equipping. It's just a wealth of resources. Check the playlists, and please subscribe if you haven't. We're just cranking right along. God bless you, and we will talk to you soon.